So maybe you're like me and you felt like you've kind of wasted your 20s chasing the wrong dream. Maybe you got the professional degree, maybe you got the dream job, and maybe you even got the house, but deep down inside, you're just feeling super unfulfilled. Maybe while in your bed, while you're about to go to sleep, you're stuck doom scrolling on Instagram, watching everybody else hit their milestones while you're just trying to get by. You're just trying to survive. But this is where you're getting it all wrong. To be honest, it only takes a few mindset shifts and practical strategies to turn your 30s into the most productive and fulfilling decade yet. And today I'm going to just share some unique insights and perspectives that really helped me kind of make this shift. You might be asking, like, how do I know this works? Because this was me. I had the 6-figure pharmacist job back in the day. I had the long-term ride or die relationship. And even though I didn't have the house, I was investing at least 50% of my income toward my retirement. And so my financial life was all set. But even though on the surface, it felt like I had most of my life figured out, deep down inside, I was really miserable. And of course, being the most responsible person ever, I walk away from all of it without any plan. And now, fast forward today, I get to spend hours practicing jujitsu, going to coffee shops, and I've actually, for the first time in my life, I can say I've created a multiple 6-figure business, just shooting videos in my bedroom. And actually, as we're talking, I'm actually in Asia. This was a lifelong dream since I was 25. I'm 36 at the time of the shooting. But before we kind of go into those unique insights, I think we need to talk about something that is commonly overlooked. You know, today's podcast was actually inspired by, I wouldn't call it therapy, but it's like mental health coaching by Dr. K, Healthy Gamer GG. Amazing YouTube channel, by the way. A lot of the things like that I know now, I wish I knew in my late 20s and 30s. I watch a lot of Chris Williamson. I watched the Alex Hormozy episode. And one of my favorite episodes from that Modern Wisdom podcast is when they're both just like breaking down kind of the lessons and the mindset shifts and all that.
I knew I needed to do something, and then I filled all this extra time not doing that thing. And then the moment I did it, I was like, wow, that took way less time than I thought it was going to take. And not only that, it took way less time than it took me to delay to actually get to this point. And if I had only started with just doing what I was supposed to do, I could have done 4 or 5 other things that I was also supposed to do by this exact same point.
And just one simple mindset shift can help you feel the difference between feeling stuck and really finding your path. And I really kind of experienced this probably about a year or two ago when I was just like really in my feels. If you haven't followed me for a while, dude, I'm in my feels a lot sometimes. I've been honing masculine energy, but just learning how to emotionally regulate myself. And that's the proudest accomplishment that I've had over the last like 2 to 3 years. Hormozy shared a lot of things like really expanding the time horizon and just realizing that we all die one day. Other people's opinion literally, objectively, don't really matter in the long-term time scale, right? At first that's like, oh damn, that's pretty bleak, but it's very liberating. And so my thought was like, how do we get more of these mindset shifts or lessons that will really kind of hack our brain? In my 20s, when I was coming out of pharmacy school, I was like, man, I really want to find my passion. Something I didn't realize back then was I was really looking for the wrong thing. Was I really looking for passion? Because passion kind of assumes like this high energy, excitement, like the requirement of being blissful or happy 24/7. And maybe I'm screwing up the definition, but that's like what I kind of got from passion after reading all these like Tony Robbins books and personal development things, right? And I realized like things get boring over time, things get more routine over time, and some things like don't feel that great all the time too. Like a great example is like jujitsu, right? No one likes getting mounted and getting cross-faced and like getting submitted. No one likes that, but that's part of the process. And over time, as I'm improving, I actually enjoy those moments. Like I don't enjoy in the moment, but I'm enjoying that I'm getting better over time. So what is that? Because that's not really exciting. Well, it's not like a huge excitement like you get on a roller coaster if you're going skydiving. So what is that? I just started thinking about like this concept of alignment where we're chasing this like self-actualization. And I think the other day, actually in my notebook, let me grab it. When I think about like self-actualization, it's a state of achieving mastery, being your best self, and living a meaningful life. And it's an achieved state, not a continuous effort. So that's basically a definition for personal development. And today, I actually have 7 things I want to cover with you guys, and I'll make this nice, short, and sweet. The feeling of being behind in your 30s is a lot different than being in your 20s. What I realized in our 30s is that we feel behind not because of our external life sometimes, and we might be still, but a lot of times it's our internal In your 30s, you can probably afford a like really nice dinner. A lot of the people I talk to, they have their family figured out, they have their career, they have their health. Maybe you still feel behind despite these external things, but that's when my journey for mental health started, because I don't have the family thing figured out. My career is like booming right now, which is really cool. Never been more active in my life ever. I'm doing jujitsu like almost every day, yoga, like going on daily walks and all that sort of stuff too. So that's when I started to focus on mental health, because I noticed like things like, oh, I was running on old story patterns, right? Like, and I'll talk more about this later in this podcast, but I'd be in these ruts where I'd be like, oh, I don't feel like I'm worth it. Trying to figure out my relationship life too, and why I have this avoidance toward dating when I didn't really have it before. And I just find myself being more and more jaded over time with relationship life. I realized I have these beliefs too, that 20 plus years that don't serve me anymore. I realized that like I tell myself that I'm lazy and all this sort of stuff. And a lot of this programming wasn't even from me. It's from my dad, actually, who used to tell me that all the time. I don't want to say I can't do as much as before, but I have to be more intentional with my energy. And I see how like more efficient I run now than before. I can do a lot more with a lot less. And that's something about getting older that I really appreciate. Some of the reasons why I started with like things like therapy or mental health coaching was like, one, I don't know why I sometimes have the need to perfect myself. And this is actually coming through the podcast too. I think because of those things, like realizing those old stories, the relationships, the beliefs from 20 plus years ago that don't serve me anymore, I realized three things right now. It's like, one, I still don't feel happy even with the business, with the YouTube, that doing pretty well right now. I noticed that I've been avoiding my relationship life from what I told you before, and almost having this like instinctual like, oh my God, I don't even want to think about this, right? People will like intentionally try to set me up and I'm just like, I don't know, I'm not ready. My automatic answer is no. Like I go into the survival state. As I was having these sessions with Dr. K's team and stuff, I realized that holy, even though I go through these things, I'm a lot further where I was just a few years ago. And as I was listening to the session, which was all inspired by this session, I realized I changed a lot. If I knew about these like different frameworks and perspectives a lot earlier, it would spare me a lot of heartache and self-doubt. So, okay, let's go into the different frameworks. Self-worth is BS. And so growing up, I always felt my worth was very transactional. Like I used to think that my worth was tied to my job title, tied to number of subscribers I had, or the money I made, where I lived and stuff. When I tell my stories like about my Asian American experience with my Asian dad, with my household and stuff, a lot of people really, really relate. I reflect on it and I'll tell you some of the experiences I went through, but when I was growing up, I noticed myself like, oh, dad won't love me unless I bring like straight A's home. I wasn't a straight A student all the time. Sometimes I was, but if I don't do well in school and I don't pursue a career that makes a lot of money, then I'm useless. What I realized was like, those things that we hear, whatever your story might be, you listening to this, something I've gotten a lot better at is like, who is talking? Who is saying this? A lot of times what I find is that like my younger self, people talk about inner child work all the time. Chances are your inner child is not saying this. Kids don't say these things. It's usually an adult figure, usually a parental figure or some sort, that come into your life and tell you these things and instill their beliefs into you. And I realized that a lot of times it was my dad actually. My mom was very loving, but my dad was very like avoidant. He had like PTSD from the Vietnam War. My dad didn't grow up with a dad because my grandfather died after World War II, coming back fighting the fascists, fighting for the US side. My family's, I think, like 4th generation Chinese, but yeah. It's pretty crazy. When I thought my worth was tied to my job title, the subscribers, the money I made, when I left pharmacy, I had a huge existential crisis. When my exes left me during that time, it was even worse. When I like moved out of LA, right? Because I was just like, I have no sense of stability right now. I felt like I lost myself. I felt like I drank the ayahuasca that killed my old self. And it wasn't until I really took this time into isolation here in Vegas. And that was actually the real reason why I came, because I needed to find myself again. I needed to retreat and be in a place of silence and routine where I just go do jujitsu, make videos, and just work with clients that I really love without the pressure of the financial stuff. That's why I came to Vegas, because it was so much cheaper here too. And plus taxes are huge. But it wasn't until this where I really started intrinsically valuing myself and I found peace. And my friend, Dr. Eugene Choi, I worked with him for a little bit. He's actually a really close friend too. Such an amazing coach that made me realize like, what does worth it actually mean? If we think about it, what does worth it actually mean? How do you assess someone's worth? And you might say money, you might say job, prestige, all these external things. But think about it. If you have a loving relationship with your parents, they might not make a lot of money. They might not have the most prestigious jobs. What is their worth to you? When you think about, I'm not a dad yet and I want to be one day. But like when you have a kid, I mean, by that definition, they're useless as they're just draining your money, like causing a lot of stress, But here you have people saying that these people are priceless. And that's why, like, when it comes to worth, there's even contemplating like, oh, am I worth it? How do I measure my self-worth? That's already a losing battle. Because the truth is, even when I had those definitions of external success of like having the pharmacy job, making 150K per year and all that, I realized that no amount of external success would fill this internal void that I had. What I realized, the key takeaway is like, you can't measure people's self-worth. Worth isn't dependent on your achievements or other people's opinions, as cliche as that sounds, but you literally can't measure someone's worth. And even if you were, it's all subjective stuff anyways. And so this leads me into the second thing. Success is defined by your own terms. This goes back to what I was talking about, right? Like earlier. So growing up, I did a lot of things to get that I'm proud of you moment from my dad. I did a lot of things just so that my dad would notice me and recognize me. Like back in high school, I did everything from Kung Fu. I was doing varsity swim team. I was doing a job at GNC part-time during the weekends in high school. And I was taking 11 APs and honors in high school. And I was literally killing myself. I remember being under so much stress. I had the worst acne ever. I was always like really stressed out. It was probably one of the hardest times in my life because I was pushing myself and just trying to see how far I went. To be honest, I don't regret any of those moments because it really made me realize about what I'm capable of. And it's one of the reasons why I went to accelerated pharmacy school and all that too. And even had the belief of starting the YouTube channel and stuff too. Like all things, like in your childhood, eventually you get older, you grow up, and you move out of the house. And then there's the adult success metrics of what we talked about. Even though I didn't get caught up with like the external stuff of like, oh, driving a really nice car or like having a big house or anything like that, I often found myself chasing other sources of external validation, whether it's from like clients, friends, or romantic partners. It almost feels like, if you ever watch The Boys, how Homelander always hates being disliked and just wants to be loved by the people around him. That was kind of like me. And I noticed like I would go out my way doing things like for people, like giving them rides or paying for meals that for people I didn't really like, but I noticed this need for validation that was really truly rooted in my childhood. I think during this time, like people really saw me as successful, but I didn't feel the success or accomplishment myself. One moment that really changed everything was when I saw my dad pass away. I saw how much regret he had in his life. Like I asked him like, hey dad, what are some of the things that you really regret in your life? And I don't remember what he said, like it's so long ago, but I just remember the look in his eyes. And I was like, I don't want to be like that. And so the moment I quit pharmacy and I had an existential crisis, I was like, who am I? If I'm not making this like same career money, if I'm not a pharmacist, then who am I? I had to really teach myself during that time to stop defining my success by the career and money I made. And ironically, when I stopped doing that, I started making way more money too. Chris Do says it all the time. It's like one of the best things that you can do for your personal brand is just like get therapy, because if you're always being controlled by these validation metrics or these things that people instill in your mind, then you'll never be able to walk away from a deal. You'll never be able to have leverage. But that's more business stuff. We'll talk about that some other time. But that's the interesting part, right? If we're not defining success by these external metrics anymore, what do we define success by? I like to take something like from Buddhist philosophy about like being in the present. I think there's a lot of wisdom in Eastern thought that is like really crapped upon by the Western society. If I think about Hormozi, he says if we extend things long enough, nothing truly matters and we just die. Everything that we work on will die. Even if we want generational wealth, like our gene pool will be so diluted 5 generations down, it doesn't really matter. So what does matter then? Being happy in the moment, but then I could be really happy just watching and like eating junk food all day, and that doesn't really bring true fulfillment. Self-actualization that I was talking about, this mastery of skills, mastery of being my best self and stuff, and just getting better and better and better. Naval Ravikant has this great quote. He says, play long-term games with long-term people. When I start looking at everything as a game, what are the games I like to play? I like playing the game of relationships, So like making friends and connecting people together and becoming a super connector. What a blessing to be called a super connector by Vanessa Lau. And Chris Do said the same thing, which is amazing. So the game of networking and relationship building, and I like being a YouTube creator and the business end of YouTube creator. So creating videos and all that, educating, but also like helping creators monetize. It's really, really fun just to create products and services that actually help people. So there's that, and learning all the skills associated with that. And then there's like the physical. Like I really enjoy jujitsu, like insanely enjoy jujitsu because it is so fulfilling, getting better, working techniques, expanding your ideas, testing your ideas. I enjoy those games. And so I evaluate myself on the future self, the person I want to be. Yes, there's goals and stuff and milestones that I like kind of have written down for each one of these things. But the more I do, the more I realize I actually don't care about those things whatsoever at all. Like I actually care about just getting better. To some people, it's really, really weird, but for me, it makes a lot of sense and it feels like the right way. So my point is that success is 1000% subjective. We can define it in a way that aligns with our true values and the person that we want to be, not just by our bank account. If you want a more objective way of looking at things, like I cannot tell you how many times I've had high ticket sales calls. Back in the day, I came in with these assumptions that people automatically want to make more money. That's what success is, but we can't assume. And that's why so many people suck at sales, because they assume all these things. We have to dissolve all that. So let's talk about the third thing. Perfectionism compounds over time. You know, so often we think about compound interest when it comes to our finances. And sometimes we'll talk about like atomic habits where we get 1% better every single day. But something that we don't consider are the traits that aren't so sexy that compound over time too. So when I was scaling my YouTube business over the last year, hiring different contractors and editors and all this unsexy stuff that you don't see behind the scenes about like running a YouTube channel, I noticed things like my perfectionism coming into play, especially when I was hiring new people. I noticed myself getting really frustrated, also having super high standards. And I felt my perfectionism was kind of affecting their work, their judgment. Like one, I would spend stupid amount of hours reviewing their work, like when getting started. Two, because of the amount of edits or feedback I had, they weren't trusting their own judgment. And a lot of these people are actually better than what I do too. And I was just like bleeding all over the place. And three, it was getting a lot harder to hire new people for the channel just because I needed someone with high skills and high empathy and all this. Now, Hormozy talks about this like as a good thing, to have high standards, to have all these things. But I know like my history and my childhood and stuff, I need to be very cautious about my perfectionism because it bleeds all over the place. And I started thinking like, what other ways is this perfectionism like affecting my life, right? And another area that I noticed was actually my dating life, believe it or not. Just for context, I haven't really been dating for the last 3 years. There's a few different reasons, but I think the major reason is like in my past dating life, I always felt like I had to be the perfect partner, right? I had to be a provider, I had to do all these different things. And there was such an insanely high standard that caused me to stop pursuing relationships out of fear of not meeting those expectations, right? Being the perfect partner, boyfriend, husband, all this sort of stuff, right? And it was just really weighing down on me. And the unfair part or the crazy part is like perfection is like just like worth it. It's the same conversation. How do you judge someone's worth or whether something is perfect or not? You really can't. And it wasn't like my other partners asked for this. It was these own standards that I kind of set for myself, right? What was even worse was like if a relationship didn't work out, this haunting voice of like, it was because you weren't good enough and all this other stuff comes into play too. And it was one of the reasons why I was so avoidant in my last relationship, even though I think in a different timeline, different place, we probably would have been a better match. Part of learning, part of growing is making mistakes. There's no way that you can grow without making mistakes. It's just like doing jujitsu without ever getting submitted. That's just not going to happen. It's just a fact of the game, right? And that's how you learn. Something that no one ever tells you is the weight of your mistakes feel like they compound over time too. I noticed this not only with myself, but even my friends who are my age too. This is actually one of the reasons why I recently went to mental health coaching again, because I noticed myself setting obsessively high standards and trying to force ideal outcomes. The lesson I learned is like this perfection perfectionism, like the sooner that you kind of resolve it. And when I don't wait like 10 years to kind of go to therapy and resolve this sort of stuff too, our negative self-identity compounds over time too. Because imagine if I was still 20, how much more could I have done? Let's talk about the next one. You can't force growth in outcomes. I actually recently heard a recent podcast by Dr. K with Chris Williamson, and he was talking about this concept that we don't have any control over the outcomes if we think about it, right? For example, if we do a YouTube video, I can produce as many videos as I like. And while there are things that I can do, right, I can shift the odds in my favor by working on my thumbnails and ideas and all these other things. I think like, yes, I can be a catalyst. I can do things that will speed up that process. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's going to be a longer journey, right? You have a seed, you plant the seed, you water it, you do all these things, you can put fertilizer and all that to make it grow faster. But ultimately tomorrow, it's not going to be a tree. It's almost a balance of balancing patience and the catalyst, like what we have control over. I've learned to have this kind of like patience with all my goals. So I realized that I'm probably not going to have $1 million business overnight. I'm probably not going to get a 6-pack overnight. And I'm probably not going to just find happiness overnight too. These things are obtained over time. The art of noticing is key for making better decisions. So a lot of times I think like through pharmacy school, through a lot of different things where we feel that the missing gap is knowledge sometimes, or having certain experiences. And that is true somewhat. It does pay the ignorance tax. So I'll give you an example. Something I noticed like with myself is like, I tend to be a lot more emotional versus logical. I can turn it on, but by default, I'm a more emotional person. And I notice myself reacting impulsively to situations which cause like unnecessary stress. Just for context, I grew up in a very Asian household. My dad fought in the Vietnam War. Now I look back, he probably had undiagnosed PTSD, which he took out on our family. Sometimes he'd be really, really cool with us. Other times he would just explode and yell at us for hours, and I was always walking on eggshells 24/7. I got really good at emotional monitoring, like not only with my dad, but with other people, and I would just see how people would react, and I would people please and kind of change my own actions to avoid conflict, right? And this led to a deep-rooted habit of people pleasing and stuff, right? When you're a kid, it doesn't matter as much the consequences, but when I got older, when I started building my career as a pharmacist and later ended up in high ticket sales, my people pleasing was rewarded for it, right? When I first learned sales, I was very people pleasy and wouldn't highlight the bad parts of an offer and stuff. And it was almost like playing a nice guy, right? When a nice guy is almost too perfect, you feel like there's something wrong with them, or you know that they're trying to manipulate reality so that they can get what they want. When I started off my own path, I noticed that in my creator business, I felt an overwhelming amount of responsibility to deliver the world to my clients. I realized this pressure that I was putting on myself was unsustainable and led to burnout. In the moment, as a people pleaser, your first thought is like, okay, if I do this, they won't be upset at me and it'll avoid conflict, so it's cool. But what I didn't realize was that there was resentment against myself. And I started doubting my own decisions and stuff too. As I started meeting people like Chris Do and just being around Hormozy and other people like that, they have a sense of non-reactance and they don't strategize to get people interested in them, to work with them or anything like that. They're just themselves. And even Ali Abdaal is kind of like this too, man. He's just like himself. So the lesson I kind of learned here was like the lesson of non-reactive living, being able to notice your emotions and not reacting. And so I really think there's a high correlation between how well you notice your emotions and emotional regulation, not letting our impulses get the way. Because emotional regulation is the art of noticing. We think that denying our emotions is a way, but it's really not that. It's not letting our emotions automatically make decisions for us. And by noticing, we're able to do an intervention, right? Like for example, like, oh, I noticed myself really craving junk food right now. What's really going on? Am I stress eating? Is there something bothering me? Or like it works with anything too. Emotional spending, no FAP, everything. I think a big part of being able to have tough conversations is being able to label your emotions in the moment. Next lesson is being alone and feeling lonely aren't the same thing. You know, recently I've been hosting these events. I have this book called The 2-Hour Cocktail Party. It's a really great book, one of my favorites. And one of the reasons why I've been able to network with so many people, like And it's really fun in the moment. Like I don't love planning events, but I love meeting people. I love introducing my friends to others. And that's a game that I really love to play. But what I realized after having these events was like, even though I was surrounded by these people, after events, I would feel so alone. And I was telling my friend this, right? Like actually my friend Eugene, and he asked me a really important question, right? Like, are you feeling alone or lonely? And I don't think we're ever taught the difference between the two, right? Like, despite being around people and having a pretty busy social life, I see people every single day, I felt loneliness. I think the feeling that is probably the easiest to compare to that people talk about is like after they go raving, they take special candy. And after the special candy, so I don't get demonetized, they feel a crash, right? Their serotonin takes a hit and all that. And no matter how many people I was with, it just never felt enough. And I really took this art of like the art of noticing and like, I noticed that you're feeling this way. Like what could be causing that? What is going on? What's on your mind? And to be honest, I'm still trying to figure this out. The answer I kind of realized was like being alone is about being physically isolated, right? And for a lot of people, that's not the case. If you do things like jujitsu, you're talking to people, you're with people, right? If you're in coffee shops and stuff, you're with people. If you're hanging out with friends, like you have those basic things. Those things are very, very important. But then loneliness is really about emotional fulfillment, not physical presence. And what I realized was like, oh, that loneliness, there's a huge correlation between like meaningful relationships and just having the presence of people. And to be honest, I don't really know what that emotional fulfillment looks like. It could probably be part of like my relationship life and all that. I'm still trying to figure it out. I think it's really important sometimes to realize like, oh, noticing the difference between being alone and feeling lonely. If you're like me, then you can realize that your loneliness can stem from like lack of deep, meaningful connections, or having connections where you can truly be yourself and really like express how you feel. This awareness has honestly forced me to kind of be more intentional with my friends. I don't need any more physical presence friends, right? I'm looking for emotional fulfilling relationships. I'm not into like trying to hook up with random girls and stuff. I want to build a family and stuff, you know? That's like more important to me. So being more intentional with my relationships, and I can make an intervention there. But the key takeaway is loneliness is about emotional fulfillment, not just physical presence. Lesson number 7, I wish I focused on my mental health more in my 20s. So this is kind of goes back to that compound effect, but in my 20s, I was always constantly chasing external validation, whether it was my job, clients, or relationships. As I get older, I noticed some of my friends, they're chasing those similar things, right? A lot of the entrepreneurial friends that I know, they love the work that they do, but especially 9-to-5ers, since a lot of people hate what they do. Like in consulting, they talk about the golden handcuffs. One of my friend's siblings consulting, their whole family is pretty much consultants. They're in huge amount of debt, but they're making like over $1 million per year because they're inflating their lifestyle and stuff. And a lot of times we try to numb ourselves from that, right? Like we're trying to seek out that external validation to fill some sort of void or something that we deeply want, right? Because at the end of the day, when we die, no one's really going to care about like which car you drove, like whether you drove a black Tesla Model X or anything like that. No one cares about that sort of stuff, right? When you throw death into the equation, it doesn't really matter, right? Those tangential type of things. And I realized for me, even though I never got in that game of like wanting more and more and more and inflating my lifestyle, I think a huge part of my identity was just to get that I'm proud of you from my dad, which I never really got as a kid. You know, my dad never showed up to my graduation. My dad was never supportive. I asked him for help. I would always feel like I was always get yelled at for, he would always say I was lazy just for asking for help and entitled and spoiled. So I just learned not to ask him for help, but it created this gap. And how lonely is it? You're a kid, you're a teenager, no strong masculine figure in my life. My mom was amazing. She was always there, but women can't teach men how to be men. And I'm having to figure out all this sort of stuff. And when I put it in this like context, it's no wonder why I was always people pleasing, because I wanted that intimacy or that connection I never got from my dad. And when I got older, it wasn't my dad anymore, but other people became my dad, like my clients or my pharmacy boss who was a asshole. And those are the automatic systems that we don't catch ourselves, that we kind of fall in automatic mode. Even when I did hit certain goals too, like this other part that no one talks about is like this feeling of not good enough bled into my life too, where like I was always comparing myself to other people's accomplishments. You know, I was always comparing myself like, oh, blah, blah, Ali Abdal did this, Christo did this, Dan Coe did this, blah, blah, blah. Why am I not here, right? And it's this constant like comparison that stole the joy of my like own accomplishments. Focusing on more on mental health, I would have told myself like, bro, Kevin, I'm proud of you. It's giving those moments to ourselves back. I realized that mental health and that intrinsic self-worth would save me a lot of unnecessary suffering and this like self-belief that, you know, there's this thing called confirmation bias, or like this self-fulfilling prophecy where we have these beliefs and it leads us to doom. So if we feel like we're not good enough to start a business, we will find ways to self-sabotage ourselves and take indirect actions to make sure that we don't hit that. And this is the invisible game that we don't see. As much as people want to clown on it, the truth is, like, even in the highest levels, I'm so fortunate to have like a bunch of like UFC people like at my gym and stuff, and they share like the mental health stuff too. Like, it's like, you know, sometimes they might have doubt, but they have to delude themselves into being the best, or just reminding themselves that they're the best in the world. And I wonder if I focused on my mental health, I worked on it more, it would have prevented a lot of unnecessary suffering. And I think about the compound effect that I was mentioning earlier about like these positive habits for our mental health. So I talked a lot about, you know, kind of the lessons I learned through mental health. Like, you might be like me in your 30s and you're just like going through this like check, like this sounds like me, I'm going through this. Is it too late? And I did want to talk about this. It's not too late to focus on mental health. Notice I didn't say therapy. I think there's this actually toxic belief in the mental health space right now where I see a lot of women say like, oh, if a man doesn't go to therapy, I don't want to date him. I think that's sometimes kind of jumping the gun. I think therapy is a tool, right? It's very helpful. I go to therapy, but definitely it's not for everyone. It's just like a hammer or like a screwdriver, right? Hammers are really great, right? But when there's a screw, you're not going to use a hammer every single time. And I think like mental health coaching, journaling, even doing a deep work like journal and just starting off with that. I do feel sometimes, like I was talking to my coach the other day and I was like, bro, sometimes I just wonder if it's too late for me, especially like being 36 and thinking about how far I am from where I want to be and all these goals I want to accomplish. I feel like I'm running out of time. I notice these thoughts and I notice I'm spiraling. And so I take a step back. There's this concept, the gap and the gain. I can always compare the gap, the lack in my life. When I think about the gain, I'm just like, damn, bro, like you found Ali, you're taking courses with him and now he's your client. And now just today, he gave me a raving testimonial. I'm like, that is crazy. I think about all these people I've seen online and I'm friends with them now, or at least like I can talk to them. I'm like, that is freaking crazy. And so it's so easy to judge ourselves on the gap, but we never really think about the gain that we kind of have too. The goal isn't to be happy 24/7. We are all humans. Emotions happen. But I find that working on my mental health, you know, if you're especially new and you're kind of like a millennial or like you're older and you're listening to this and you're just like, dude, bro, like mental health was gay back in the day and like therapy is stupid, and you can have your own thoughts about that, but maybe it doesn't have to be that. Maybe that's a good place to start, because Christo, like I said, he has this quote where it's like, I'm paraphrasing, but like the best thing you can do for your personal brand is get a therapist. And it forces us to self-reflect and do things better. I think the main thing what I'm trying to say is like, it's important to take a step back no matter what modality that you use. And I found that mental health over time, the goal of it, just like jujitsu, it's to decrease the frequency of doom and gloom moments over time. And even if you are starting later, it's not too late to see significant improvements in your mental health. And we see this all the time, man, like with our physical health too. Like you see people in their 40s get super, super fit. I saw one of my friends like I met at Barbell Brigade years and years ago. He's competing for bodybuilding shows and stuff, and he was really overweight in his 30s, man. Just like how you wouldn't tell your close friend try to take control of their physical health or their money or start a business, we shouldn't do the same for mental health too. And my opinion, and this is the final lesson I'll talk about, is like emotional growth and mental health improvement can happen at any age, and it's never too late to start working on it yourself. Because if you plan on being on this planet, even if you're, no matter what religion you are or what you believe, if there's an afterlife or not an afterlife, you're still gonna probably spend quite a bit of time on this planet. So might as well optimize every single present moment that we have by bringing more awareness to our mental health. When I do jujitsu and stuff, like half the game is mental. There's so many times I want to bitch out, knowing that I feel like bitching out and I am a bitch are completely different things. And I think you'll be able to regulate like your panic moments and be able to think your way and be more strategic out of your ways for combat, business, just general life. What is your advice to someone who feels behind in their 30s? I'd love to hear that. See you in the next podcast. Bye. Peace.